The golden sun rose over the Nile, turning its waters into a ribbon of shimmering light. Palm trees swayed gently along the banks, and the calls of waterfowl echoed across the marshes. Egypt, the cradle of kingdoms, breathed under the weight of centuries of tradition, ritual, and power. Yet behind the towering temples and the perfection of stone monuments lay a world of fear, isolation, and sacrifice, the world of the pharaohs. In the heart of Thebes, the royal palace stood like a fortress of silence. Its corridors were lined with lotus columns, and the air smelled of incense burned endlessly to please the gods. Here, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, walked slowly through the halls, his bare feet brushing against polished limestone. Servants bowed low, their eyes fixed on the ground. No one dared look directly at him. To the people of Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a man, he was a living god, chosen by Ra himself. But within the walls of the palace, he was a prisoner of divine expectation. From the moment of his birth, Amenhotep was surrounded by whispers. His body was frail, his features unusual, and priests murmured that the gods had shaped him for a purpose only they could understand. His childhood was not filled with laughter or the warmth of a mother's arms. Instead, it was a careful grooming, a strict discipline that taught him that his every breath belonged to the gods and his people. He learned early that pharaohs did not live for themselves. They lived as vessels for eternity. At dusk, the court gathered in the great hall. Rows of nobles and generals stood on either side, their faces stern, their eyes sharp. The vizier, recited reports of grain harvests, trade routes, and border skirmishes. But behind the numbers lay darker truths. Famine lingered in the villages, the army was restless, and the priests of Ammonius, guardians of Egypt's vast temples, grew more powerful than the throne itself. Amenhotep listened in silence, his thin fingers tapping the carved armrest of his throne. Each word carried weight, for he knew he was trapped in a constant battle, not with swords, but with belief itself. The people worshipped the gods. The priests controlled the gods. And the pharaoh, though called divine, often bowed to their will. But Amenhotep was different. Deep within, he carried a disturbing vision, one that would shake Egypt to its core. He dreamed of tearing down the old gods, of replacing their endless temples with a single devotion, the Aten, the sun's eternal disk. This thought alone was enough to spark rebellion in the hearts of his people. Yet he kept it close, a dangerous secret that grew like fire in his chest. Night fell. In his private chambers, the pharaoh sat alone. The golden oil lamps flickered against murals of falcons, jackals, and lotus blooms. His queen, Nefertiti, entered silently, her tall crown gleaming in the dim light. Her beauty was legendary, but her eyes were sharp, eyes that saw not just a husband, but the weight of an empire. "You are restless," she said softly. Amenhotep turned to her, his voice low. "I am pharaoh, yet I am nothing. The priests rule through me. The people worship statues of stone while their children starve. I will change this, Nefertiti. Even if it destroys me." Her hand rested on his shoulder, warm yet cautious. "Then you must tread carefully. A pharaoh who offends the gods is a pharaoh who invites his own tomb." Amenhotep closed his eyes. He knew her words carried truth. Every pharaoh before him had faced the same burden, sacrificing personal desire for the appearance of eternal order. But what was order, if it served only those who exploited the people in the name of gods? The weight of kingship was not the gold crown on his brow, it was the silence, the isolation, the crushing expectation that his life was never truly his own. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Egypt thrived and suffered in equal measure. Farmers bent over the fields, their backs aching beneath the sun. Craftsmen chiseled stone, building tombs that would outlast their names. Soldiers guarded the borders, their loyalty stretched thin between pharaoh and priesthood. To them, pharaoh was a distant figure, one they never touched, never heard, but whose decisions shaped the rise and fall of their lives. And so the myth of the pharaoh lived larger than the man himself. While the people dreamed of divine kings, the reality was far darker, a ruler bound by tradition, cursed by loneliness, and watched at every step by those who would see him fall. One night, Amenhotep wandered into the temple of Ammonius. The vast hall was filled with the smell of incense, and towering statues loomed in silence. Torches flickered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed alive. He gazed up at the colossal figure of Ammonius Ra, carved in stone, and for the first time, he felt anger. "Are you the true God?" he whispered into the darkness. "Or are you a mask that men wear rule in your name?" The silence answered him, heavy and eternal. In that silence, Amenhotep made his decision. He would defy the priests. He would proclaim the Aten, the sun itself, as the one true God. And in doing so, he would reshape Egypt forever, or condemn it to chaos. But what he did not know was that every step he took toward this vision would come with betrayal, blood, and suffering. For Egypt was not ready to let go of its gods. And the priests of Ammonius would stop at nothing to preserve their power. Thus began the disturbing life of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, a life not of golden luxury as many imagined, but of unrest, suspicion, and endless struggle. The palace that glittered in the sun was, in truth, a prison of rituals and secrets. His crown was heavy, not with jewels, but with shadows. And as the Nile carried its eternal flow toward the sea, Egypt itself braced for the storm that was coming. The story of the pharaohs was never one of peace. It was one of sacrifice, ambition, and the unbearable loneliness of power. And for Amenhotep, the true battle was only beginning. The first whispers of change began not with grand proclamations but with subtle shifts inside the palace. Amenhotep IV, restless and consumed by visions of the Aten, started to withdraw from the lavish ceremonies that honored the gods of his ancestors. The festivals of Ammonius, once marked by processions through the streets of Thebes, suddenly lacked the presence of the pharaoh himself. To the priests, this was more than insult, it was a direct challenge. In the court, tension thickened. Generals exchanged uneasy glances. Advisors hesitated before speaking. The vizier, who had served pharaohs before Amenhotep, leaned closer to his ruler one evening as the court dispersed. "My lord," I said in a hushed tone, "tradition is not easily bent. The priests of Ammonius are patient, but their patience is not endless. Already, they whisper that the favor of the gods may be slipping from your hands." I's brow furrowed. Perhaps. But men can wield more danger than gods, especially when they command the loyalty of half your kingdom. Despite the warnings, Amenhotep pressed forward. He began commissioning new temples, not to Ammonius, Osiris, or Ra, but to the Aten. Unlike the shadow-filled sanctuaries of the old gods, these temples were open to the sky, their courtyards bathed in sunlight. The designs were radical, simple, almost bare, their walls decorated with images of the radiant disk that reached down with rays ending in human hands. The people were confused. To some, it was a refreshing devotion, a god they could see each morning when they lifted their eyes to the horizon. To others, it was heresy, a betrayal of the very traditions that had bound Egypt together for centuries. Nefertiti, ever watchful, stood at her husband's side through these reforms. But even she saw the strain they brought. One night, as the pharaoh lay awake, staring into the shadows above their bed, she whispered, "The more you give to the Aten, the more you take from Ammonius. Balance, my king. Balance keeps the Nile flowing." Amenhotep turned to her, his voice heavy with conviction. "The Nile flows because the Aten gives light. Without the Aten, there is no harvest, no breath, no Egypt. Why should we bow to stone idols when the sun itself sustains us?" Her silence lingered. She knew he would not bend. And deep inside, she wondered if his determination was brilliance, or madness. The priests of Ammonius, however, did not wonder. They plotted. In the shadowed chambers of Karnak, High Priest Pernefer convened with his council. The air was thick with incense, but the tension cut sharper than any blade. "The boy pharaoh forgets himself," Pernefer said, his voice low but seething. "He dares to starve the temples of Ammonius of offerings, to drain our wealth for his own blasphemous sun god. If he continues, Egypt will unravel. We cannot let this stand." One of the older priests leaned forward, his hands trembling. "The people still see him as divine. To move against Pharaoh is to move against Ma'at itself." The balance must not be broken. Nefer's eyes narrowed. Ma'at is not his to command. If Pharaoh betrays the gods, then he betrays Egypt. And Egypt must be preserved, no matter the cost. Beyond the temples, unrest spread quietly among the soldiers. Pharaoh's generals were loyal to his crown, but they also relied on the priests, whose influence provided food, land, and favor for the troops. Whispers reached the barracks. Would Pharaoh's obsession weaken Egypt's defenses? Would the Aten's temples drain resources needed for war? One young captain, Horemheb, listened to the rumors with growing unease. He admired Pharaoh's courage but feared his vision would fracture the kingdom. In hushed gatherings, soldiers spoke his name, Horemheb, as a man who could restore order if the throne faltered. The seeds of ambition were being planted. Yet for Amenhotep, the vision of the Aten burned brighter than any threat. He ordered the construction of a new city, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, far from Thebes, far from the suffocating power of Ammonius priests. The desert sands shifted as thousands of workers, craftsmen, and slaves toiled to build a capital dedicated entirely to the sun disk. Nefertiti stood beside him as the foundations rose from the barren ground. She marveled at his determination, but she also saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll of ruling not just a kingdom but a revolution. "Will the people follow you here?" she asked. "They will," he said firmly, though a shadow of doubt crossed his face. "For when they see the Aten rise above Akhenaten, they will know this is the true home of Egypt's soul." But even as stone walls rose and streets took shape, tragedy struck closer to home. Amenhotep's daughters fell ill, one after another, their frail bodies burning with fever. Physicians mixed potions of herbs and honey, priests offered prayers, but nothing could stop the sickness. The cries of the royal children echoed through the palace, a sound that pierced deeper than any political threat. Amenhotep, desperate, lifted his arms to the blazing Aten each morning. "You give light to all the world, why not to my blood? Why do you let them suffer?" For the first time, his faith trembled. Nefertiti wept silently at night, her face buried against his chest. In public, she was strong, the queen whose beauty symbolized Egypt's glory. But in private, she was a mother watching helplessly as her children slipped away. Rumors spread quickly through Thebes and Akhenaten alike. If the Aten could not save the daughters of Pharaoh, how could it save Egypt? Whispers of doubt grew louder, and the priests seized the moment to inflame them. "The Aten is blind," they muttered in the markets. "The true gods turn their backs on a pharaoh who betrays them." Amenhotep's reforms now balanced on a knife's edge. He pressed on, renaming himself Akhenaten, he who serves the Aten. But his enemies grew bolder, and even within his court, loyalty began to fracture. Vizier I counseled caution, but his loyalty was increasingly tied to survival. Horemheb, the ambitious captain, gained the ear of generals who no longer trusted Akhenaten's vision. And in the shadows, the priests of Ammonius plotted the unthinkable, not only the ruin of Akhenaten but the very erasure of Akhenaten's name from history. One night, as the desert winds howled outside the palace walls, Akhenaten sat with Nefertiti on the balcony of their half-finished city. The stars shimmered above, eternal and indifferent. "Do you ever wonder," Nefertiti asked quietly, "if our names will be remembered with honor, or cursed with hatred?" Akhenaten stared at the horizon, where the first glow of dawn touched the sands. "They may curse me. They may try to erase me. But they will never forget me. For I will have shaken Egypt to its core. And even if my temples fall, the truth of the Aten will burn in every sunrise." His words carried conviction, but beneath them lingered an unspoken fear that the very gods he defied were watching, waiting, and weighing his soul. And so, the disturbing life of the pharaoh pressed onward, marked not by gold and glory, but by defiance, loss, and the creeping shadow of betrayal. The Nile continued its eternal flow, indifferent to the struggles of kings, while Egypt itself trembled between two faiths, two destinies. The story of Akhenaten was far from over. And in the shadows of Akhenaten, forces were already moving to decide whether he would stand as a prophet, or perish as a heretic. The desert winds carried whispers through the half-built streets of Akhenaten. Dust settled on the pale limestone blocks, and the sound of chisels echoed from unfinished temples. For a city meant to be the horizon of the Aten, it already felt uneasy, half dream, half burden. Pharaoh Akhenaten walked among his people in the new capital, his figure tall but gaunt, his robes heavy despite his thin frame. To some, his presence was inspiring. To others, unsettling. He was unlike any pharaoh before him, his features elongated, his movements deliberate, as though each step carried the weight of eternity. Children stared at him in awe. Merchants bowed low, yet their eyes carried doubt. Soldiers saluted, though some hesitated before their hands met their foreheads. Faith was fragile here, stretched thin across a city built on conviction rather than tradition. Inside the palace, Nefertiti moved with quiet grace, yet her heart was restless. She watched her husband dedicate himself entirely to the Aten, his devotion unshaken even as tragedy lingered in their household. Their daughters had grown weaker still, and though some survived the fever, others did not. The palace echoed with the silence of rooms once filled with laughter. At night, when the city slept, Nefertiti often sat alone in the women's quarters, her hands brushing against the small trinkets of her children. She remembered their tiny voices, their soft laughter, and the way they had once played in the palace gardens. The weight of grief pressed heavily on her, though she rarely showed it to her husband. Akhenaten carried his own sorrow, but he buried it beneath ritual. Each morning, he raised his arms to the rising sun, offering prayers to the Aten. Yet, deep within, he wondered if the God who gave light to the world had turned away from his family. The priests of Ammonius, far away in Thebes, did not let grief distract them. They saw weakness in it. Reports reached their ears that Pharaoh's children were dying, that the people questioned the Aten's power, and that soldiers murmured in discontent. To the high priest Nefer, this was a sign that the gods themselves demanded action. The Aten blinds him, Nefer said to his council, his voice sharp. He builds his city, but he cannot build loyalty. The soldiers grow restless, the people grumble, and the gods demand their due. If we wait, Egypt itself will shatter under his hand. The council agreed, but they moved carefully. Pharaoh was still divine in the eyes of many, and open rebellion would tear the kingdom apart. Instead, they sought to erode him quietly, through whispers, through doubt, through the slow poisoning of loyalty. One soldier in particular became the focus of their attention, Horemheb, the ambitious captain who had risen quickly through the ranks. He was disciplined, respected, and, most importantly, uncertain about Pharaoh's vision. Messengers found their way to him, cloaked in secrecy, speaking of duty to Egypt, of loyalty not to one man but to the gods and the eternal order. At first, Horemheb dismissed them. But as months passed, and as he watched Akhenaten drain Egypt's resources, his resolve began to waver. He admired Pharaoh's courage, yet he feared his stubbornness. A leader who defied tradition might inspire, but he might also destroy. In the palace, Akhenaten's reforms grew bolder. He ordered the chiseling away of Ammonius' name from temples, the erasure of the old gods from stone. Statues were toppled, shrines abandoned. For the first time in centuries, Egypt was being torn from its religious foundation. The people were uneasy. Some obeyed, fearful of Pharaoh's wrath. Others resisted quietly, keeping small statues of the old gods hidden in their homes, whispering prayers in secret. Farmers still prayed to Hapi for the Nile's flood, mothers still called upon Tauret for safe childbirth, and families still whispered Osiris's name when burying their dead. The old faith lived in shadows, refusing to die. Nefertiti saw the tension growing like a storm. She warned her husband gently, urging patience, urging compromise. But Akhenaten stood firm. The Aten is all, he told her. The old gods are chains. I will break them, even if Egypt bleeds for it. His words were fierce, but his eyes betrayed the loneliness that shadowed him. For all his power, he was a man increasingly isolated, surrounded by walls of devotion that kept even his loved ones at a distance. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red across the horizon, Akhenaten gathered his council. Vizieri, Queen Nefertiti, generals, and officials stood in the great hall of the unfinished palace. The walls glowed with fading light, the rays of the Aten painted across their faces. I have given Egypt a new city, a new god, and a new destiny, Akhenaten declared, his voice steady. But our enemies grow bolder. The priests cling to their idols. The people cling to their fears. We must show them that the Aten is stronger than doubt. I spoke cautiously. My lord, strength can be shown in mercy as well as in might. The people will follow you if you ease their burdens. But if you push too hard, they may break. Akhenaten's gaze sharpened. Mercy will not build the future. The Aten demands devotion, not compromise. A silence followed. Even Nefertiti lowered her eyes. In that moment, the divide between Pharaoh and his court widened, subtle but unmistakable. Outside the palace, unrest stirred. Workers complained of exhaustion, soldiers grumbled about unpaid rations, and merchants feared the decline of trade routes once supported by temple wealth. The grandeur of Akhenaten masked the cracks forming beneath its foundations. One night, in a dimly lit barracks, Horemheb gathered with trusted soldiers. The air was thick with dust and secrecy. Our pharaoh is bold, Horemheb said, his voice low. But boldness without wisdom is ruin. He builds a city while the people starve. He destroys gods that have guided Egypt for generations. If Egypt falls, what good is the Aten to us? The men nodded, their faces grim. For the first time, the thought of action, unthinkable before, took root in their hearts. In the palace, Nefertiti sensed the shift. She saw the way servants hesitated when they spoke the pharaoh's name. She noticed the sidelong glances exchanged between generals. She felt the unease that spread through the air like smoke. Her loyalty to her husband was unshaken, but she feared that he was losing the kingdom piece by piece. Late at night, she approached him as he stood on the balcony, gazing at the stars. "You are building a vision, Akhenaten," she whispered. "But visions are fragile. You must not forget the hearts of the people who live beneath it." He turned to her, his face pale in the moonlight. "I have given them the truth. If they reject it, they reject life itself. Would you have me surrender to lies?" Her silence was heavy. She loved him, yet she feared the path he carved for both of them. The turning point came slowly, like the tightening of a rope. Reports arrived from the borders, unrest in Nubia, raids from the Hittites, whispers of rebellion among Egypt's own vassals. With the kingdom's strength stretched thin, the priests of Ammonius saw their opportunity. Their influence seeped quietly into the cracks of Pharaoh's rule, feeding doubts, stirring discontent. And then, tragedy struck again. Another daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti grew ill and did not recover. The palace was cloaked in mourning. Once more, the Aten had failed to protect the blood of Pharaoh. Once more, the people whispered in secret. If the Aten could not protect Pharaoh's children, how could he protect Egypt? At the funeral rites, where traditional prayers were forbidden, the people stood in uneasy silence. The priests of Aten chanted praises to the sun, but the mourners' eyes were hollow, their grief unanswered. Among the crowd, some dared to bow their heads not to the Aten but to the memory of Osiris, their whispers carried on the wind. Akhenaten stood stiffly, his face pale, his hands trembling as he raised them to the blazing sun overhead. His voice cracked as he proclaimed, "The Aten is eternal. The Aten gives life. The Aten takes life. We must trust in the Aten's will." But in the crowd, the silence was heavier than belief. From that day, the balance shifted. Loyalty frayed. Generals muttered openly. Merchants complained. Farmers prayed in secret to gods they were forbidden to name. And in the shadows, the priests of Ammonius tightened their grip, preparing for the moment when Egypt would turn against its pharaoh. Nefertiti felt it most keenly. She saw the sorrow in her husband's eyes, the cracks in his conviction, the loneliness that wrapped around him like a shroud. She feared for him, not only as pharaoh but as a man, a husband, a father. And yet she could not stop the tide rising against him. The city of Akhenaten glimmered in the desert sun, its temples rising proudly to the sky. But beneath the golden light, Egypt trembled. The people were divided, the gods were at war, and the throne itself stood on fragile ground. The disturbing life of the pharaoh was now rushing toward a reckoning. And somewhere, in the silence of night, a plan was being made, a plan that would decide not only the fate of Akhenaten, but the destiny of Egypt itself. The city of Akhenaten shimmered in the desert sun, its limestone walls glowing white against the barren cliffs. From a distance, it looked like a vision of eternity, a city dedicated to the Aten, radiant and new. But within its streets, the truth was different. Beneath the golden light, shadows lengthened. The workers complained of hunger. Soldiers grumbled in their camps, their pay delayed, their loyalty uncertain. Merchants feared ruin as trade faltered, once rich with the wealth that poured from temples now stripped of offerings. To the people, Pharaoh's dream of the Aten was no longer just a strange faith, it was a burden they bore in silence. Akhenaten, however, walked through his capital with a gaze fixed on the horizon. His devotion burned as fiercely as ever. Each morning, he stood before the rising sun, lifting his arms in praise. His voice carried across the courtyards of the new temples, echoing against their open walls. The Aten gives us life. The Aten sees all. The Aten is truth. The priests of the Aten, dressed in plain robes, repeated his words like a chorus. But among the crowds, eyes lowered not in reverence but in weariness. Some bowed from duty. Others whispered silent prayers to gods forbidden. Even within the palace, the strain was felt. Nefertiti watched her husband with a heavy heart. She admired his faith, but she saw the isolation consuming him. He no longer listened to counsel as he once had. He trusted only the Aten and himself. At night, she tried to reach him. Akhenaten, she said softly as they sat together beneath the stars, the Aten may be eternal, but the people are not. They hunger, they grieve, they doubt. You must see them, not only the sun. He looked at her, his eyes tired but unyielding. If they cannot see the Aten's truth, then they are blind. I cannot bow to their weakness. Her silence lingered between them. She loved him, but she feared the distance growing wider each day. In the military camps outside the city, Horemheb's name spread quietly among the soldiers. He was no pharaoh, but he was steady, a man of discipline and strength. He listened to their complaints, ate their bread, and spoke plainly of Egypt's needs. The Aten may rise each day, Horemheb told them one evening, but the Aten does not march to war. It is men who hold the borders, men who bleed for Egypt. And men must be led by wisdom, not by stubbornness. The soldiers murmured in agreement. Many still swore loyalty to the throne, but loyalty frayed easily when hunger gnawed and wages failed. In the dim glow of torches, whispers grew, if Egypt needed saving, perhaps Horemheb would be the one to do it. Far away in Thebes, the priests of Ammonius tightened their net. They sent envoys through villages, spreading doubt about Pharaoh's new god. In markets and taverns, voices carried the same refrain, the Aten cannot protect us. The true gods are forgotten, and Egypt suffers for it. Pharaoh, the high priest, knew the time to strike was approaching. A pharaoh who turns against the gods is no pharaoh, he told his council. But we must not strike blindly. We must let Egypt turn against him itself. Then we shall step forward as saviors. Their plan was patient, but effective. Doubt seeped like water into the cracks of Pharaoh's rule. Inside Akhenaten, grief returned once more. Another of Akhenaten's daughters fell ill. Despite prayers, offerings, and desperate pleas to the Aten, she withered before their eyes. The palace mourned in silence, but outside its walls, the people whispered louder than ever. If the Aten cannot save Pharaoh's own children, how can he save us? The question spread like fire. Each death in the royal household became a blow against Pharaoh's vision. Each unanswered prayer fueled the people's longing for the old gods. Akhenaten, stricken with grief, stood longer each morning before the sun, his arms trembling as he lifted them high. His prayers turned into cries, his devotion a desperate plea. But the silence of the Aten was unbroken. And though he proclaimed strength, his face grew thinner, his body weaker, his spirit burdened by sorrow. Vizier I, who had served loyally for years, began to weigh his own survival. He counseled Pharaoh with careful words, but he also watched the shifting tides. He saw the soldiers' unrest, the merchants' anger, the priests' growing influence. And though he did not betray his king openly, he began to think of what would come after. One afternoon, Nefertiti walked the streets of Akhenaten in disguise, wrapped in simple linen, her face veiled. She wanted to hear the people's voices without the barrier of ceremony. What she heard troubled her deeply. They say the Aten blinds Pharaoh. Our bellies are empty, yet his temples rise higher. The old gods would not have let this happen. Nefertiti returned to the palace shaken. That evening, she confronted her husband. You must listen to them, Akhenaten. They are turning against you. They will not follow you into the darkness if you force them from their gods. He looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and anger. You doubt me too? I do not doubt you, she said firmly. I fear for you. For us. For Egypt. A pharaoh without his people is no pharaoh. For the first time, he turned away from her in silence. Tension rose further when reports arrived from the borders. The Hittites were growing stronger, pressing against Egypt's influence in the Levant. Vassal states sent desperate messages begging for support, but Akhenaten delayed. His attention was fixed on the Aten, not on war. To him, the true battle was spiritual, not military. But for his generals, this neglect was unforgivable. Horemheb, now commanding growing loyalty among the troops, spoke openly, if Egypt does not defend her borders, Egypt will lose more than faith. She will lose her land, her power, her very soul. Inside the palace, the distance between Pharaoh and his court widened. At council meetings, silence fell after his declarations. Eyes turned to the ground, loyalty given in form but not in heart. Even Nefertiti, once his closest ally, grew quiet, her warnings unheeded. One night, she stood alone in the gardens, gazing at the stars. She wondered if the gods, old or new, had abandoned them both. She wondered if the price of Akhenaten's vision would be not only Egypt's unity but her family's very survival. And then came the day when the people's patience broke. In the marketplace of Akhenaten, a fight erupted between two men, one who praised the Aten, another who clung to the old gods. Words turned to blows, blows turned to chaos. By nightfall, the streets were filled with shouts and torches. Temples of the Aten were defaced, statues damaged, walls scrawled with forbidden names, Ammonius, Osiris, Ta. The city that was meant to be eternal shook with unrest. Akhenaten stood before his court, his face pale with fury. They dared defile the Aten? They dare defy me? I bowed low, his voice cautious. My lord, the people are desperate. Force will silence them for a day, but fear cannot bind them forever. Then I will bind them with truth, Akhenaten declared. If they resist the Aten himself. But his words rang hollow in the hall. Even his courtiers could no longer hide their doubt. Outside, soldiers hesitated to act. Many sympathized with the people. Some quietly joined them. And in the barracks, Horemheb's name was spoken with open hope. He had not yet raised his hand against Pharaoh, but the thought lingered, unspoken yet powerful. Nefertiti, standing in the shadows of the palace halls, felt the storm closing in. She knew Egypt was reaching a breaking point. She knew her husband's dream had set forces into motion that could no longer be contained. But she also knew that, somewhere in the heart of her people, there was still a choice to be made. Would Egypt follow the Aten into an uncertain future? Or would it return to the old gods, abandoning the pharaoh who had dared to challenge them? The answer was drawing closer with each passing day. And in the silence of the palace, as the Nile carried its eternal flow through the desert, the disturbing life of Pharaoh Akhenaten edged toward a reckoning. The unrest in Akhenaten could no longer be ignored. Days of rioting gave way to nights of fire. The walls of the city that had once gleamed with light now bore the scars of defiance. Torches flared in the darkness, and chants for the old gods echoed louder than the hymns of the Aten. Inside the palace, Akhenaten sat in his hall of pillars, staring into the flames of the oil lamps. His once radiant face was drawn, his body thinner, his spirit frayed. He had devoted everything, his crown, his family, his soul, to the Aten. Yet now, as the city shook with anger, he felt the weight of silence pressing harder than ever. Nefertiti entered quietly. She wore no crown, only simple linen. She had been among the people again, listening, watching, feeling their despair. Her voice was steady, though sorrow edged every word. "They will not endure this much longer," she said. "The old gods are in their hearts. You cannot strip them away." Akhenaten lifted his eyes, filled with a sorrow so deep it bordered on despair. "Do you not see, Nefertiti? They cling to shadows while the sun gives them life. I sought to free them from lies. I sought to bring them truth. And yet," she whispered, "they see your truth as a cage." His hand trembled as it tightened on the arm of his throne. For the first time, doubt cracked through his voice. "Was I wrong?" Nefertiti stepped closer, kneeling beside him. "You were not wrong to seek the light. But perhaps you were wrong to deny them choice. A pharaoh may guide, but he cannot force the hearts of men." Her words pierced him more deeply than the chants outside ever could. In that moment, Akhenaten realized that his vision, as radiant as it had been, was never truly shared. It was his alone, and he had tried to bind a nation with it. Outside the palace, soldiers hesitated as unrest grew. Horemheb walked among them, his voice calm, his presence firm. He had not declared rebellion, yet the men already looked to him as though he were their true commander. "Egypt must stand," he told them. "If Pharaoh will not defend her, then we must. But remember, we serve Egypt, not ambition, not revenge. Egypt." The men nodded, torn between duty to their king and duty to their land. In Thebes, the priests of Ammonius saw their moment. Envoys arrived in Akhenaten, carrying messages of reconciliation. But their words were blades wrapped in silk. "Pharaoh," they wrote, "return the temples to the gods, and peace may yet be restored. Refuse, and Egypt shall crumble." Akhenaten burned the message in fury, but the ash drifted silently to the floor. Even fire could not erase the truth. Egypt no longer belonged to him alone. The breaking point came one morning, as the Aten rose in the sky. A crowd gathered before the palace gates, louder and larger than ever before. They carried images of Ammonius and Osiris, statues hidden for years but brought out now in defiance. Their voices rose like a storm, "The gods of Egypt return. Pharaoh has forsaken us, we will forsake him." From the balcony, Akhenaten looked down upon them. For years he had lifted his arms to the sun, believing his people would follow. Now he saw only anger, grief, and rejection staring back. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, Pharaoh was silent before his people. Behind him, I and the courtiers exchanged uneasy glances. Some turned away, unwilling to share in his humiliation. Others already calculated what would follow. Nefertiti stood beside him, her face pale but composed. She placed her hand over his, steadying him as the chants grew louder. "Akhenaten," she whispered, "this dream has consumed you. But dreams cannot rule forever. Perhaps it is time to let go." He closed his eyes. The sun's warmth touched his skin, yet he felt no comfort. In that moment, he knew his reign was ending, not by a sword, but by the will of his own people. The days that followed blurred into sorrow. Akhenaten withdrew deeper into the palace, avoiding counsel, avoiding even the light he had once worshipped. Some said illness consumed him. Others whispered his heart had broken beneath the weight of failure. His figure grew frail, his voice weaker, until he was but a shadow of the king who had once defied centuries of faith. When he finally passed, the palace fell silent. There was no great mourning, no wails of grief echoing through the streets. To many, his death was simply the end of an experiment, a chapter closed. But to Nefertiti, it was the loss of a man who had dared to dream too greatly, who had loved the light but could not see the shadows it cast. In the aftermath, Egypt shifted swiftly. The temples of Ammonius reopened, their priests stepping into power once more. The statues of the old gods were raised, their names spoken again in prayer. Akhenaten, once meant to be eternal, was abandoned, left to crumble in the desert winds. Horemheb, steady and disciplined, grew in strength. His leadership restored order to the army, his loyalty to Egypt clear. In time, his path would lead him to the throne, though not yet. And Nefertiti, whose fate became shrouded in mystery, remained a figure of intrigue. Some claimed she took power briefly, ruling in the shadow of her husband's fall. Others whispered she vanished, her name erased by those who sought to bury the memory of Akhenaten's reign. But no erasure could fully succeed. For though Egypt turned back to its gods, the scars of Akhenaten's dream remained. The Amarna years became a cautionary tale of vision and hubris, of devotion and blindness, of a pharaoh who reached for the sun but lost his hold on earth. Centuries later, the ruins of Akhenaten would still stand in silence. The sand would swallow its streets, its temples, its halls. Yet in broken walls and faded carvings, whispers of that disturbing reign would linger. Archaeologists, thousands of years later, would walk among its ruins and ask the same question Nefertiti had once spoken. Was he wrong? No answer would ever be final. For Akhenaten's story was not simply one of failure. It was the story of a man who dared to challenge eternity, who loved an idea so fiercely that he gave everything to it, even as it consumed him. And so, his legacy remained, both haunting and profound, a reminder that even pharaohs, who claimed divinity, were still bound by the fragile, unpredictable hearts of men.